Okay, so this talk is called Relativity Deniers. I'm dealing with an article published in the New Scientist collection by a historian, and the article is called The Relativity Deniers. And this is the historian who wrote the article. Isaac, she's a historian of science interested in the interrelationships between modern science and its social and political context, and so forth. So she refers back to the early days of when Einstein became famous. She says, this is how she starts the article: "This world is a strange madhouse," remarked Einstein in 1920 in a letter to his close friend, a mathematician called Grossman. "Every coachman and every waiter is debating whether relativity theory is correct. Belief in this matter depends on political affiliation." Einstein's general theory of relativity, published in 1915, received an overwhelming public response, not all of it positive. Numerous accounts which appeared during the 1920s claimed to show relativity was wrong, and Einstein received many letters from lay people who claimed to have found the ultimate refutation of his theory. So Einstein became famous in 1919, and after that people started to complain about his theory because it was brought to their attention more because of his fame. And even nowadays there are messages sent to scientists saying Einstein is wrong, and they get dismissed in the way she explains below. This is what she says: "Many of today's physicists and astronomers, not to mention science journalists, continue to receive this kind of mail," probably email as well as by post now, "on densely written papers on pages and increasingly rambling emails, blog posts and online comments. Such self-proclaimed scientists keep trying to foist their astonishing simple solutions to much discussed problems upon genuine academics. Yet what flourishes today on the fringes of the internet was much more prominent in the 1920s in the activities of a movement that included physics professors and even Nobel laureates." So she's referring back to the time in the 1920s when physicists and so forth were complaining about Einstein's relativity, and nowadays there are still people complaining about Einstein's relativity. So Einstein was blaming those who criticised his relativity as being based on their politics, and this is what she says. And Einstein is writing saying political elevation was responsible for the fierce opposition to relativity theory ? She's questioning whether that was the reason why they were opposing Einstein's relativity theory. And she carries on, she says, "A few years ago I had the opportunity to access papers belonging to the physicist Ernst Gach, one of the most outspoken critics of Einstein in Germany. As I delved into the material he had neatly collected in banana boxes, a whole world of anti-relativity emerged from hundreds of pamphlets, thousands of newspaper clippings and piles of letters from Einstein's opponents across Europe and the US." So she's referring to just one of these physicists who was complaining about Einstein's relativity. There was quite a few others. And this is the physicist that she is referring to. He was a German experimental physicist. He was director of the optical department at the Reich Physical and Technical Institute. She carries on in her article and she says, I discovered that the group opposing relativity was much broader than many historians believed till now, and that their tactics had much in common with those used by creationists and climate change deniers today. Their reasons for countering relativity were also more complex and varied than is usually thought. Even Einstein misjudged the motivations of many of his opponents. So my comment is that there was a lot of different reasons why people were saying Einstein's relativity is wrong. They approached the issue from lots of different points of view. Some of those few points of view were better than other points of view. Geik was an experimental physicist, as she points out, at the Imperial Technical Institute in Berlin. Like many experimentalists of that era, he felt uncomfortable with the rise of a theory that demanded reformulation of the fundamental concepts of space and time. Relativity messes with these to the extent that events which one observer deems simultaneous are no longer simultaneous as viewed by observers moving in different frames of reference. So what's being complained about is the metaphysical description that Einstein's relativity was bringing in about the flexibility of space and time, space-time curvature, etc., which wasn't how physics up to then was being described in terms of. So this person was opposed to the metaphysical description that was being brought in. And this person could not imagine such a scenario. In 1921, he argued that given that the idea of absolute time threatened to confuse the basis of cause and effect in natural phenomena, what's more, the theory of relativity abandoned one of the most important concepts of 19th century physics, that light waves and electric and magnetic forces were carried in a medium called the ether. For a classical physicist like himself, giving up this notion was akin to somebody today claiming that sound waves travel in a vacuum. So his viewpoint is that it's an ether. And one of the things to note is the different ways that word can be spelt. It can be spelt E-T-H-E-R or A-E-T-H-E-R. Einstein says in 1905 in his paper on special relativity, the introduction of a luminescence ether will prove to be superfluous. So that's what he was thinking in 1905. But he later seems to have changed his mind, i.e. in 1920. And this is the relevant place on the internet dealing with that. It was a talk that Einstein gave on the 5th of May 1920. He chose the topic ether and the theory of relativity. In that talk he says, recapitulating, we may say that according to the general theory of relativity, space is endowed with physical qualities. In this sense, therefore, there exists an ether. According to general theory of relativity, space without ether is unthinkable, for in such space there not only would be no propagation of light, but also no possibility of existence for standards of space and time, and by that he means measuring works and clocks, nor therefore any space-time intervals in the physical sense. But the ether may not be thought of as endowed with the quality characteristic of ponderable media, as consisting of parts which may be tracked through time. The ideal of motion may not be applied to it. So what he's doing is referring to some type of ether. So this historian Razak is going by what Einstein said in 1905, and not taking into account what Einstein's change of mind was in 1920. And all historians of science seem to be doing the same thing. They take what Einstein said in 1905 and ignore what he later said, and then they make out Einstein's theory is a theory without an ether. And everyone like physicist Gaiark who think there is an ether are deemed to be wrong, and any letter from someone saying there is an ether is discarded as that person being a crank. What Einstein said in 1905 has become dogma for these people. One of the problems is not everyone takes the viewpoint that there is an ether when criticising relativity. But those who take that viewpoint get dismissed as cranks, along with all those taking different points of view as to why Einstein's relativity is wrong. So maybe some points of view for criticising Einstein's relativity are valid and other ones are not valid, but you've got this big criticism of Einstein's relativity about the ether, and Einstein seems to change his mind about the ether. She goes on to explain it as, what's more, the theory of relativity abandoned one of the most important concepts of 19th century physics, that light waves and electric and magnetic forces were carried in a medium called the ether. Classical physicists like Gaiark giving up this notion was akin to somebody claiming that the sound waves travel in a vacuum. So I'm reiterating what's just been said. Those objections were first raised in scholarly journals with discussion restricted to academia, but after a key prediction of general relativity was confirmed during an eclipse in 1919, Einstein was transformed into a media star, and the debate acquired as much broader public impact. In 1919, the New York Times published an article headlined "Lights All Askew, in the Heavens, Men of Science More or Less Agog over the Results of Eclipse Observations," while a German magazine celebrated Einstein as a new giant of world history. In the years that followed, the newspapers reported on everything from his clothing and Jewish background to his affection for music. So, totally annoying that Einstein changed his mind. This is the account that she's giving. She takes it up to 1919 when Einstein becomes famous, and then Einstein was possibly going by the 1905 idea that there was no ether, and so she's taken that as the theory, and she's not taken into account that 1920 Einstein was changing his mind. What Einstein said in 1905 becomes the dogma for what is the history of the events up to 1919, and then him changing his mind is not going to enter into that historical account. The issue of return to the ether idea gets dismissed with the next few words she uses. People were also troubled by more fundamental questions. In December 1921, the letters page of the Times, yes, a newspaper of London, carried a lively discussion of whether space is actually endowed with the physical qualities as general relativity required. Opinion was clearly divided. So the issue of space endowed with physical qualities is another way of saying that there's a possible ether type of thing. Whilst saying opinion was clearly divided is a way of saying there was no agreement as to whether there was an ether type thing. Instead of recording history as they couldn't reach agreement about an ether type thing, she manages to discard the ether with a few appropriate adjustment of words. It's not worth going into the other points of view of the critics of Einstein's relativity, which includes criticism that Einstein was a plagiarist, etc., which he goes into, because the issue of ether is the most fundamental. Is there ether or is there not an ether? And the way words are played with by historians, the historical account is to say, as per Einstein, 1905, there is no ether, and ignore Einstein changing his mind later. The historical account is biased, prejudiced, and thus corrupted. So the mainstream, it just keeps sweeping certain things like this under the carpet. There is controversy over whether the ether should be brought back into physics, but the way the historians are going to write the historical account, they're going to dismiss the idea there's an ether. They're going to go by Einstein 1905, who doesn't have the ether, and ignore Einstein changing his mind. Finn, thank you. So that lets you know how easily things get corrupted. A historical account is given and it doesn't give fair representation of different points of view as to what is happening. Instead, it's just going to give you a biased point of view that there's no ether. Thank you. The end.